2020 is very nearly over. And good riddance, we say. Amongst all the awfulness of 2020, however, there's been some great video game releases, which has perhaps made the year much more bearable. We've put our heads together and come up with a list of games which we think are the cream of the crop of 2020. We might not have given these games the best scores at the time, but these are the ones that have stuck with us, that we've returned to time and time again. We could have attempted to assign an order to our picks of the best games of 2020, counting down to one ultimate game of the year. But frankly, it would be impossible to do in any meaningful way. Figuring out just what is and isn't appropriate to show on television is a tricky thing, as artistic and cultural standards change all the time. Once upon a time, showing a married couple sleeping in the same bed would be an inappropriate scene, which is why Lucy and Ricky slept in separate twin beds like 6-year-olds on I Love Lucy. Each of us has our own favorites for different reasons, and every game on this list is as worthy as a GOTY award as the next. Still, there are times when audiences themselves decide that TV shows have simply gone too far. So we've presented them in alphabetical order. Without further ado, here are our best games of 2020. How many have you played? Among Us available on Switch, PC, mobile. Chris says, yes, Among Us was originally released in 2018, but if the Game Awards can get away with making it a 2020 game, we're sure as hell going to. Certainly, this asymmetric betray 'em up was entirely off our radar until streamers shoved it into the limelight. Here's a look at some scenes that fans at the time thought were wildly inappropriate and in some cases, still do. Hannibal, the face-eating scene. Standards and practices may have varied over the decades, but there's one thing that has always been a given in network television: don't show a guy eating his own face. Well, Hannibal apparently didn't get that memo, because in 2014, they decided to let the world know exactly what that would look like. There's joy to be had, sabotaging your fellow players' efforts, dispatching them one by one, but it's also fun figuring out who the imposter is, holding your breath for that moment when you discover you're right or wrong. Even though there are only 3 maps right now, no 2 matches are the same. The human factor makes sure of that. And the growing sense of paranoia you feel leads to mistakes being made. Was Yellow really following you, or was that just coincidence? Maybe you should follow them to check, but then what if people think you're the imposter? You might end up cursing as, rightly or wrongly, you're ejected from the spaceship, but Among Us is never boring. Animal Crossing, New Horizons available on Switch. Kim says, launching on the 20th of March this year, Animal Crossing, New Horizons arrived at the time when we all needed it most. Just as most of the world was going into lockdown for the first time thanks to COVID-19, New Horizons offered us all a colorful escape. Not only did character Mason Verger rip off his own face and eat it, he also fed some of it to his dog first, because he's a good and loving master apparently. NBC sure has come a long way since Golden Girls. Tiny Toon Adventures, One Beer. You wouldn't think a scene about dudes drinking beer would be considered inappropriate. But consider that this scene took place in the decidedly kiddie cartoon Tiny Toons, and the dudes drinking the beer are lovable and underage animals: Buster Bunny, Plucky Duck, and Hampton Pig. Also, consider that the scene ends with them drunkenly driving a car off a cliff to their deaths. Gone were worries of viruses, furlough and government mess-ups. Needless to say, parents were definitely not amused, and the episode was immediately yanked from reruns forever. The X-Files, Home. Some consider Home the best episode in the history of the classic sci-fi series 10 Files. Others consider it one of the most depraved moments ever shown on television. Both might be right, but does the fact that the episode is good make it appropriate? That's what critics and fans were left debating after a terrifying scene where Mulder and Scully discover the inbred and mutated Peacock brothers have been procreating with their own mother, a quadruple amputee they kept under their bed. On our Animal Crossing islands, all we had to worry about was getting up early enough on a Sunday morning to buy some turnips. Animal Crossing, New Horizons was destined for success anyway, but its timely arrival meant it's been an integral part of everyone's yet. The episode was the only one in series history to receive a TVMA rating, for mature content.
Ya think. Nathan Barley. Underage acts. Not content with causing one major child abuse outrage, Chris Morris stepped up to bat again with his 2005 6-episode satire on London media twats, with Nathan Barley, co-written with Black Mirror creator Charlie Brooker. This time, he smashed the ball of offense so far outside the park of good taste that it left a flaming trail of cringe all the way into the stratosphere. Episode 5 featured the eponymous hero and proto-hipster social media celebrity Nathan Barley paying a highly vulnerable drug addict for oral sex. Bright, colorful and relentlessly cheery, it's been the perfect antidote. We've all made new anthropomorphic friends, we've visited new islands and we've built ourselves a new home, all without ever leaving the couch. Honestly, no other game could have offered such an ideal escape in 2020. Assassin's Creed Valhalla available on PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, PC, Stadia. Kim says, only Ubisoft could release 3 huge open-world games in the space of a month. That in itself would be inappropriate enough on any other show, but Nathan Barley cheerfully twists the knife even further. And, to the developers' credit, all 3 of them have been excellent, and all 3 scoring a place on our list of best games of 2020. While the act is happening, Nathan receives a call from his love interest. She has some urgent news. The girl Nathan is with is only 13 years old. Just as he hears this, Nathan climaxes. Perhaps the best of the 3, though, is Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Yes, this was a real show that was really shown on mainstream TV. But fear not, traumatized viewers. The episode's big twist comes when, after a full-blown meltdown panic, Nathan discovers the prostitute is actually 18 pretending to be 13. Even after that, bad taste wins when Nathan's vacuous friends are impressed that he seemingly abused a minor. It's certainly the biggest and most technically impressive of them. Taking the Assassin's Creed series back to England, in a time where Vikings were invading and claiming the land for themselves, you'll take on the role of Ivor as she sets out from Norway to find a new life in England. The episode ends with Nathan sat on a bus, loudly boasting about, splashing the tonsils, of someone, illegal. Time for a shower. Seinfeld. A Puerto Rican mistake in the penultimate episode of the groundbreaking sitcom Seinfeld. A little too much ground got broken, as the humor went from offbeat to downright incendiary. Literally. The map is huge, and the amount of quests you'll discover is overwhelming, but the freedom to approach the game however you wish has never been greater. While attending a Puerto Rican Day Parade, Kramer accidentally set a Puerto Rican flag on fire, then tried to put the flames out by stomping on it. You could spend hundreds of hours here and still not see everything the game has to offer, but each moment you do spend with Assassin's Creed Valhalla will embrace you like no other. Read our review of Assassin's Creed Valhalla disc room available on PC, Switch. Becca says, who knew that a game about killer discs could be so captivating? I certainly didn't. And yet, I can't stop going back to disc room to try it again and see how far I can make it in the brutal world. In Disc Room, you play as a scientist who has ventured into an intergalactic slaughterhouse. You travel from room to room attempting to dodge the ever-changing killer discs that will cut you into 1,000 pieces again and again, and again. Don't get me wrong, it's infuriating, but it is possibly one of the most addictive games I've ever played. It's difficult to put it down because you think, just one more go, I'll definitely get it this time. Little do you know that soon, 3 hours have passed and you've made only the slightest bit progress. There's something ingenious about its simplicity, and that's what makes it one of the best games of 2020 in my opinion. Read our review of Disc Room Doom Eternal available on PS4, Xbox One, Switch, PC, Stadia. Chris says, Doom Eternal is a stonking shoot-'em-up which builds on the grand accomplishments of the original, remake. It pours on a lot of lore but does so without stifling the monster-blasting shenanigans, and the addition of non-demonic enemies shakes things up. The previous game made it clear that the Doom Slayer didn't give a toss about anything but killing demons, and Doom Eternal doubles up on that. Needless to say, many Puerto Ricans were less than amused at the sight of their flag being burnt and trampled on for a cheap laugh, especially since the episode turned out to be the second highest rated in the show's history, with nearly 39 million viewers. After numerous protests and complaints by activists, NBC apologized and pulled the episode from reruns. Brass Eye. Way too many jokes about kids. Most comedy shows wouldn't touch pedophilia with a barge pole. Brass Eye wasn't. Most comedy shows.
A 1997 series by Chris Morris for Channel 4 in the UK, it used a serious 60-minute style format to satirize controversial reports on everything from AIDS to drug abuse to an elephant getting its own trunk stuck up its backside. But it was the 2001 pedophile special that really went off the deep end. How many other games let you hijack a space cannon and use yourself as a projectile? And, for the most part, it has the same overwhelming sense of momentum that Doom had: you stay still, you die. While the platform sections weren't as big a pain as we thought they'd be, there were a couple of sections where we wanted to take a lesson from the Doomslayer and put our fist through the screen. Still, if shoot-'em-ups are your thing, you'd be hard-pressed to beat Doom Eternal. Final Fantasy VII Remake available on PS4. Richard says, I am one of the many who consider PlayStation Classic Final Fantasy VII to be one of the best games of all time. And so I was apprehensive of Final Fantasy VII Remake. With recent entries in the Final Fantasy series being far away in terms of mechanics from those that I loved in my youth, I was worried that in remaking Final Fantasy VII, Square Enix would strip it of its identity. The Petageddon episode didn't so much slaughter sacred cows as shove the entire herd into a meat grinder and dance on their bloodied remains. The episode featured scenes as outrageously offensive as a pedophile disguised as a school, a crippled pedophile being rebuilt like the $6 million man then attacking a jungle gym, and a gang of vigilantes trying to catapult themselves over a prison wall to kill the pedophiles within. The biggest controversy of all, though, was caused by the scene where Morris's presenter demands to know if a pedophile, played by Simon Pegg, wants to have sex with his 6-year-old son while the 6-year-old is actually standing there. Petageddon made the British viewing public go wild. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Final Fantasy VII Remake turned out brilliantly, taking the first major chapter of the original game's epic story and rounding it out to get you more attached to its characters and world. Changes have been made here and there, sure, but the heart of Final Fantasy VII still feels intact, making the game just as enjoyable for old fans as it does newcomers. It aired at the height of a sex offender panic and generated a record number of complaints. And then there's the twist, which I won't spoil for those who haven't played it yet, that elevates the game to the next level and makes you eager to find out what happens next. Hopefully we won't have to wait too long. If found. Available on Switch, PC, mobile. Becca says, I haven't stopped thinking about If Found since I played it earlier in the year. I started it late in the evening, thinking I'd play a bit and get back to it the next day. Not so. Once I started, I was hooked, finishing it one sitting. Morris was dubbed by the tabloids the most hated man in Britain, ironically the sort of newsroom overreaction the show itself was satirizing. Game of Thrones, Breaker of Chains. The X-Files may have had both incest and potential rape during Home, but the folks behind Game of Thrones decided to do everything in their power to top that with their 2014 episode Breaker of Chains. Incest, of course, was old hat for the series by this point, thanks to the central relationship between siblings Cersei and Jaime Lannister. So it would take a lot more than that to shock viewers. The story of Cassio and her friends manages to be unique and captivating, but also a tale that many of us are all too familiar with. Like, say, Jaime raping his sister right next to the murdered corpse of their own son. Adding insult to utter grossness is the fact that the scene was portrayed as consensual in the books, making the decision to turn it into a rape particularly questionable. It's about learning to feel confident in your own skin in spite of the negativity in your life. It's about feeling like you belong, like you're wanted and appreciated. But If Found's story isn't the only thing that makes it one of, if not the, best game I've played this year. For a show that makes its living showing inappropriate scenes, Game of Thrones outdid even themselves. Skins. Too much skin. Just how inappropriate this scene from Skins was really depends on your point of view. Many people simply shrugged when one of the show's main characters ran down the street in the nude, but the hyper-vigilant Parents Television Council had a big problem with it. Its art style is gorgeous, and the way you interact with the game is almost magical. Erasing backgrounds as you move through the story is pleasing, almost therapeutic in nature. It's an engaging, heartbreaking and wonderful story told in an incredibly beautiful way. Read our review of If Found. Immortals Fenyx Rising available on PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, Switch, PC, Stadia. Richard says, perhaps it's because I wasn't expecting much of Immortals Fenyx Rising, but it's turned to be one of the year's best surprises. It's a game that I haven't been able to put down since launch, the urge to go back to do one more quest or solve one more puzzle always in the back of my mind. And even further to its credit, despite now putting tens of hours into it, there's still so much for me to do. Taking clear inspiration from The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild, Immortals Fenyx Rising takes the Assassin's Creed template and changes it in a myriad of meaningful ways. Why? Because the actor was only 17, making it, in their eyes, inexcusably illegal. The combat is more fantastical and energetic, for example, and a stamina meter alters your approach to getting around its world. Its biggest changes are instantly obvious, however, it has a very different visual style, a playful sense of humor and a massive emphasis on puzzles. Sponsors agreed the scene was inappropriate, with Taco Bell leading the charge in abandoning the show. MTV was forced to issue a statement saying that going forward, the series would not only comply with all applicable legal requirements, but also with our responsibilities to our viewers. Still, the controversy crippled the show, and MTV ended up canceling Skins soon after. South Park, the Prophet Muhammad comes to visit shore. If you're watching South Park, you're basically accepting that you'll be offended. Needless to say, if you've ever found yourself charmed by a Zelda game, you should give Immortals Fenyx Rising a try. Read our review of Immortals Fenyx Rising: The Last of Us Part 2, available on PS4. Richard says, The Last of Us is one of the best games of all time. Inappropriate scenes are South Park's bread and butter. No doubt about it. And so people were apprehensive when a sequel was announced. Would it live up to the hype? Where could the story go? Would it feel forced? Ultimately, anybody posing such questions were left with egg on their face, because The Last of Us Part 2 is absolutely phenomenal, blowing even the original game out of the water. Challenging players to think about revenge and how it leads to nothing more than a circle of violence, The Last of Us Part 2 is a grueling journey. It masterfully blends stealth with heart-pounding action sequences, harrowing set pieces, and a story that will truly leave you thinking. Never before has a game been so dark, so violent, and so disturbing. Still, there are moments when even Matt and Trey manage to outdo themselves, creating something so offensive it's still talked about years later. Something like the Prophet Muhammad visiting South Park in an episode that concludes that violence and terrorism is the only surefire way to get what you want. Episodes 200 and 201 managed to offend a lot of people. Yet, you'll not be able to peel yourself away from it until the credits roll. Some Muslim extremists considered its gag about Muhammad wearing a giant bear costume so offensive they published a thinly veiled death threat in retribution. And after then, it'll still be on your mind. You don't so much as play The Last of Us Part 2 as you experience it. In response, Comedy Central placed a giant black censored bar over the character of Muhammad and bleeped his speech and any speech relating to him. The episodes are even heavily censored on the DVD releases. An uncensored version of 201 was reportedly hacked off the South Park servers and can supposedly be found online. And it might just change how you view video games forever. Necrobarista available on PC, coming to consoles next year. Becca says, I'll be honest, I didn't go in expecting much from Necrobarista. The story sounds a little strange on paper. You can do your own digging if you want to chance it. Threads, post-nuclear Holocaust stillbirth. In 1984, the BBC imagined what would happen if a hydrogen bomb exploded over Sheffield. Threads was a nuclear Holocaust drama so bleak it made the day after look like the Mickey Mouse Club. It set out to show in painfully realistic detail what would happen if Britain was caught up in a nuclear attack. The game takes place mostly at the terminal, a kind of halfway point between this life and the next. Folks that have just passed make their way to the terminal to spend their last 24 hours there before moving to the afterlife, or whatever it is that comes after death. Necrobarista's story focuses on the people who run the terminal. The answer was so unrelentingly grim that some say it traumatized a generation. It's hard to know where to start. You see a hand consumed in flame, its blackened skin flaking off as it hopelessly grasps at nothing. Each character has an incredible depth to them, which makes it easy to fall in love with them so quickly.
What I like most about the game, though, aside from its fantastic story and unique art style, is just how much I was able to connect with the characters in my short, 4-hour playthrough. Wailing people swaddled in bloodied bandages, unable to relieve their agony due to a lack of drugs. Not many games can pull off that kind of connection in such a small amount of time. Read our review of Necrobarista Neon Abyss available on PS4, Xbox One, Switch, PC. Kim says, as a roguelike action platformer, Neon Abyss borrows several ideas from the likes of The Binding of Isaac. Society is so broken down that children become semi-feral and guards publicly display executed looters. But it makes them its own, while also introducing many new ideas at the same time. Colorful, brash and addicting, Neon Abyss is the sort of game you sit down to play for just half an hour, but end up dragging yourself away, wide-eyed and energized, several hours later. It was the sort of dystopia Cormac McCarthy might reject as too depressing, and it was shown during primetime on BBC Two. But in this 2 hours of misery, one scene stands out. 13-year-old Ruth, raised in the aftermath of the bombing, is raped by a boy and gets pregnant. 9 months later, she graphically gives birth to a stillborn baby, it's a little disturbing, in a makeshift hospital atop the smoldering ruins of irradiated Britain. Guardian film critic Peter Bradshaw has said the scene so disturbed him he felt depressed for weeks. You see, its gameplay loop, as simple as it is, keeps you going back for more. Just one more boss, you'll say. Just one more run. It keeps you going back, because every time you play is so different. With a huge range of collectibles to pick up in any run, no two games of Neon Abyss ever feel the same. You'll amass pets, all offering various perks and the odd debuff, alongside various weapons and power-ups. In one run, you might be able to fly while firing giant bullets. Another run might let you triple jump. Other times you might not be so lucky and the odds might be stacked against you, but that's all part of the fun. As roguelikes go, it's one of the best, and one I've gone back to time and again this year. Read our review of Neon Abyss Ori and the Will of the Wisps, available on Xbox One, Xbox Series X, Switch, PC. Richard says, Ori and the Blind Forest had some issues, but it was one of the best Metroidvanias around when it launched in 2015. A year later, the definitive edition eradicated some of those issues to make it even better. Its sequel, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, released in March this year, improves by leaps and bounds on both, however. Its combat is deeper, its visuals are richer, and its story, somehow, is more heart-wrenching. You will cry at some point playing this game. Like a lot of games this year, though, Ori and the Will of the Wisps launched with numerous bugs and technical issues. Thankfully, most have been eradicated since, leaving the only blight on the experience to be a less than impressive final area. With 90% of the game or so being so amazing, however, it just had to make our list of the best games of 2020. Thanks to an impressive port, Switch gamers can enjoy it, too, while those who have fancy Xbox Series X or S consoles will find that it looks and performs better than ever. The icing on the cake is that if you're an Xbox or PC Game Pass subscriber, you can play it without forking out any additional money. Read our review of Ori and the Will of the Wisps Sackboy: A Big Adventure, available on PS4, PS5. Kim says, I usually don't have too much time for 3D platform games. It takes something really special to grab my attention, and Sackboy: A Big Adventure is just that. It ditches the creator aspect of Little Big Planet, leaving behind only its too cute for words protagonist and his thirst for colorful adventure. Swapping out 2.5D levels for full-on 3D ones, Sackboy: A Big Adventure is endlessly endearing, incredibly creative and very well put together. There's a huge range of levels on offer, all giving you something different. 1 minute you might be rounding up random animals into a pen, another you might be bouncing along to the sound of David Bowie. The musical levels are a real highlight, but even when you're not bopping to an eclectic collection of licensed music, you'll be grinning at the beautifully realized environments, textures so realistic looking you just want to touch them, and the excellent voice work from Don French and Richard E. Grant. Honestly, it's the joyous game we all needed in 2020. Spider-Man: Miles Morales, available on PS4, PS5. Richard says, upon grabbing a next-gen console at launch, you want something that really shows it off, don't you? For those lucky enough to have grabbed a PS5, Spider-Man: Miles Morales is exactly that game. Building on the gameplay of Insomniac's first Spider-Man outing, you know it's going to be a lot of fun swinging through New York City, fighting crime along the way. But what you won't initially anticipate is how good the visuals are while doing so. Spider-Man: Miles Morales is quite simply one of the best-looking games available right now. Perhaps even the best. 3 graphical settings are now available in the game, with Fidelity Mode offering all possible bells and whistles, including ray tracing at 30 FPS. Needless to say, it looks phenomenal. For those who must play at 60 FPS, a ray tracing performance mode has been added since launch, while the original performance mode takes ray tracing out of the equation but allows the game to still run at an impressive resolution. It's not just Spider-Man: Miles Morales' impressive PS5 visuals that get it a spot on our list, however, it's the overall package. It looks great, plays great, and has a great story. What's there to not love about it? Star Wars Squadrons available on PS4, Xbox One, PC. Chris says, X-Wing is back. Sort of. It might not quite have the depth or campaign length of Lucasgames' original Star Wars Sims, but it's a close second. Flying an X-Wing is fun, but what really sells us on Squadrons is jumping into the cockpit of a TIE fighter. These are the ships that were mere cannon fodder in the Star Wars saga, and here you're expected to survive against all the rebel scum. VR mode takes things to a whole new level, making you feel even more vulnerable as you soar between asteroids and debris. Multiplayer mode is fun, but, for us, single-player mode is where it's at. You end up balancing your objective with just staying alive, frantically tweaking your shields and so forth, which, admittedly, is fiddlier on a joypad. But the sheer rush you get when you take out the rebel scum is worth all the edge-of-your-seat moments. Streets of Rage 4 available on PS4, Xbox One, Switch, PC. Richard says, having spent much time in my youth hammering goons across multiple Streets of Rage titles, I was absolutely overjoyed when Streets of Rage 4 was announced. Although also cautious. Many of Sega's properties have been revived over the years and failed to hit the mark. Some failed miserably. And so I hoped Streets of Rage 4 would turn out differently, but I prepared myself for the worst. My fears were allayed, however, when I tried the game at EGX in 2019. Within minutes of play, I was reassured that it was going to be great. With Streets of Rage 2 used as a base for its gameplay, then built upon in meaningful ways, Streets of Rage 4 is an absolute treat. It's got a meaningful pace and, while easy to pick up, the combat's got a great deal of depth to it. It's the type of game you can replay over and over again without ever getting bored, especially given that it's got a solid cast of characters, along with unlockable retro variants and more. The icing on the cake is one hell of a soundtrack, composed by Olivier Derivière and guests including Yuzo Koshiro. If you have any love for the side-scrolling beat-em-up genre, this is an absolute must-have. Read our review of Streets of Rage 4. Tell me why available on Xbox One, PC. Kim says, from Don't Nod, the studio behind the excellent Life is Strange, Tell Me Why is a narrative adventure in a similar vein, but with an altogether more grounded story. Sure, protagonist twins Allison and Tyler might have some sort of strange psychic connection, but it never goes as far as Max's ability to change time. Instead, Tell Me Why's story focuses on the twins' relationship, their lost mother, and the difficulties involved in returning to your childhood home for the first time in 10 years. There are a lot of heartfelt moments squeezed into Tell Me Why, and it's hard not to sympathize with each of its main characters as you move through its 3 chapters. The way it touches on important topics, such as LGBT representation and inclusion, is dealt with beautifully, too. It never feels shoehorned in, it's just a natural part of the narrative, as it should be. It helps that it's a beautiful-looking game, too, set in small-town Alaska. It's a world that begs to be explored. It's a shame we can't see as much of it as we'd like, but the taste we do get is mesmerizing. Watch Dogs Legion available on PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, PC, Stadia. Kim says, I loved the first 2 Watch Dogs games, so it was a no-brainer that I'd also love Watch Dogs Legion. Perhaps more so, with this third entry into the series being set in London, a city I'm familiar with and have spent many hours wandering around. But as fantastic as Watch Dogs Legion's recreation of England's capital is, it's not the main draw of the game. That would be its bizarre option to omit a central protagonist. Instead, Watch Dogs Legion allows you to recruit just about anyone you want, making a team of dozens of DedSec operatives that you can switch between on a whim.
Some of them are perhaps slightly devoid of personality, but others are brimming with sass or swagger. You'll undoubtedly get attached to one or two of them. It means that no 2 playthroughs of the game will feel identical, as different characters offer up a different experience, along with a huge number of ways to tackle missions. It's huge, it's adventurous, and it's a heck of a lot of fun. It's certainly one of the most memorable games I've played this year, not to mention it looks absolutely fantastic on next-gen hardware. Read our review of Watch Dogs Legion. Welcome to Elk available on PC, Xbox One. Becca says, like most of my favorite games this year, the incredible Welcome to Elk took me by surprise. It has a unique and adorable art style that I fell in love with instantly. It takes place on the small island of Elk where everyone knows each other, and in this case, that isn't necessarily a good thing. As you play, you'll meet a host of characters, but none of them are unimportant. Each one of them has their own story that you'll discover as you play through the game. The most interesting part of Welcome to Elk, though, is the fact it's based around true stories told to the game creator by friends, family members or acquaintances. Some of these stories are fun, while others are more serious. It's an incredibly charming and wonderfully weird game that provides a unique look at the human condition, and I can't recommend it enough. Yakuza, Like a Dragon, available on PS4, Xbox One, Xbox Series X, PC. Chris says, Ichiban Kasuga is like a dragon. No, he doesn't get murdered by a Greek saint who everyone in the UK pretends is British. Instead, this fuzzy-haired badass takes over the reins from Kiryu Kazuma and demonstrates that the series can survive a substitute dragon. The open world you explore isn't anywhere near the size of Grand Theft Auto 5 or Assassin's Creed Valhalla, but it feels like a real, living world. What makes Yakuza, Like a Dragon such a joy, apart from the superb storyline, is that Kamurocho is somewhere you'd actually want to be, gangsters or otherwise. And, as a protagonist, Ichiban is just perfect. After 7 games, Kiryu's po-facedness was starting to get old and Ichiban is the perfect antidote. And, without Kiryu's reputation to fall back on, Yakuza, Like a Dragon makes your enemies seem dangerous again. The wonderfully ridiculous turn-based combat is just the icing on the cake.